What is inflation? Well, good question. In this video, I'll try to answer this question, but realistically, I think you should search up a famous economist instead. Okay, so in this video, I'll be talking about inflation, deflation, and disinflation. So first off, inflation. So inflation means the sustained increase in general price levels. So what I mean by a general price level is the average of prices of goods and services in the entire economy, not to the price of any one particular good or service. Hence, the presence of inflation indicates that prices of goods and services are increasing on average. So to reiterate that point, this is really good to know. Inflation measures how quickly the prices of goods and services are rising. There are three types: demand pull, cost push, and built-in. And the most commonly used inflation index is the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And inflation can be viewed positively or negatively, depending on the individual viewpoint and rate of change. So now I have a real-life example of inflation. Well, in this case, hyperinflation, which is very high rates of inflation. It's Venezuela. So hyperinflation in Venezuela is the currency instability in Venezuela that began in 2016 during the country's ongoing socio-economic and political crisis. Venezuela began experiencing continuous and uninterrupted inflation in 1983 with double-digit annual inflation rates. As you can see here, the inflation rate is absolutely crazy, 19,000. That is crazy. So, the crisis in Venezuela began with the presidency of Hugo Chavez, when he used the revenue from the oil to fund government spending. It was no longer sustainable to fund government spending from the revenue generated by the oil, and this caused the Venezuelan economy to shake, which led to poverty, inflation, and shortages. And again, another thing that contributed to the high levels of inflation are due to the sum total effect of relying too heavily on imports for basic goods, depending on oil as its main export, and insufficient government industries and governmental corruption. So as you can see, you needed this much to buy chicken. That's crazy. Okay, moving on to deflation. So deflation means the sustained decrease in the general price level. So inflation is far more common than deflation. In fact, since the 1930s, the Great Depression period, most economies around the world have been experiencing a rising price level, or inflation. Not saying that deflation never happened since then. Okay, so deflation, again, is when the general price levels in a country are falling, as opposed to inflation when prices rise. So when deflation happens, it can be caused by an increase in productivity, a decrease in overall demand, or a decrease in the volume of credit in the economy. And most of the time, deflation is unambiguously a positive trend for the economy, but it can also, under certain conditions, occur along with a contraction in the economy. And essentially, deflation gives a person purchasing power to some degree. Well, a greater purchasing power than before, because it has a positive effect on increasing nominal consumer spending, and it allows people to consume more but can promote economic growth and stability by enhancing the function of money as a store of value and encouraging real saving. But rapid deflation, not so good. Okay, now I have another real-life example, but this time it's Japan. So deflation in Japan, Japan's lost decade. So one of the best examples of deflation occurred during Japan's lost decade. Japan's economy became stuck in a lose-lose situation of declining prices and slackening demand between 1991 and 2001. So as you can see from this little chart here, you can see it plummets in its growth. Okay, now moving on. Japan's deflation began after its property and stock market bubble burst in the early 1990s. Ensuing losses at banks eroded their ability to lend. Inflation turned negative in 1999. So I think a lot of us are familiar with Japan's bubble period, where they were flourishing and everyone was so glammed up and it was so nice. But, the bubble has to burst, and that's what happened. So how it went down. Okay, so let's take a step back to the 1970s and 1980s, a period when Japanese businesses found a strategy to gain a competitive advantage in global markets. They achieved this by producing high-quality goods at low prices. This led to a significant boom in Japan's real estate market and the Nikkei stock exchange, which quickly grew to bubble-like proportions due to rampant or excessive speculation. The Nikkei reached its peak at 38,916 on December 29th of 1989, only to plummet by 43% in less than a year. So why did this happen, right? The reason lies in the inflationary pressures that were evident. Responding to these pressures, Japan's central bank implemented a series of interest rate hikes, effectively bursting the bubble. Speculators defaulted on their loans, businesses went bankrupt, and the banks required government bailouts. As a result, Japan's GDP contracted, and its stock market experienced a crash. So now, Japan found itself in a recession, but the conventional measures a central bank usually employs to address such issues like lowering interest rates proved insufficient. The Bank of Japan reduced rates to zero, hitting what's known as the zero lower bound, and maintained them at this level for several years. Additionally, the Japanese government attempted to emulate the New Deal policies that had aided the United States during the Great Depression, undertaking extensive infrastructure projects. Despite these efforts, Japanese consumers remained hesitant to spend the savings they had amassed. So this really dips into the topic of consumer confidence. So again, this is primarily due to a critical aspect of Japan's crisis, which revolved around the lack of consumer confidence. Lack of confidence among its consumers. Workers were anxious about potential job losses, and depositors were concerned about the possibility of bank runs. Consequently, there was a reluctance among people to spend money, which is consumer confidence. In order to finally wake Japan's economy from its decade-long slumber, its central bank needed to literally create demand by injecting liquidity back into the markets. It would turn out to be a 5-year effort. Japan's quantitative easing measures finally helped to restart the economy and get consumers spending again. And by 2003, Japan's GDP would once again reach a healthy 3% level of growth. Okay. Very, very long. Now let's look at why deflation can be serious to an economy. Well, when deflation happens, prices consistently decline, and consumers and businesses may delay purchases, expecting further price reductions in the future. So they might be like, hey, this might be cheaper if we wait. But they just keep waiting. So this delay in spending can lead to a downward spiral of reduced demand, lower production, and higher unemployment, creating a deflationary trap. And deflation increases the real burden of debt, making it more challenging for households and businesses to service their obligations. This in turn can lead to financial instability and a contraction in credit, further hindering economic growth. And another thing about deflation, why it rarely occurs in the real world. Well, central banks, like central among these is the prevailing monetary policy framework adopted by most central banks, which typically targets a low but positive inflation rate. Central banks actively strive to maintain this target to encourage spending and investment, as moderate inflation is perceived as conducive to economic growth. Furthermore, deflation is often associated with economic downturns and recessions, prompting policymakers to implement measures to stimulate demand and prevent a deflationary spiral. So the central banks and the government would do anything to get out of this recession. So it's not so common. I'd say hyperinflation is more common. I'm not sure. Please don't quote me on that. Okay, now we have disinflation. Disinflation means the fall in the rate of inflation. It doesn't mean that your numbers are negative necessarily, but it just means if your inflation rate was like 10%, but then it falls to 7%, that's disinflation. So disinflation is a temporary slowing of the pace of price inflation and is used to describe instances when the inflation rate has reduced marginally over the short term. So unlike inflation and deflation, which refer to the direction of prices, disinflation refers to the rate of change in the rate of inflation. So disinflation is usually caused by contractionary monetary policy like rising interest rates. It can also arise from increases in productivity and technology. So an example I have is the United States with disinflation. So you could just read this a bit. This is a little case study I took from InThinking. So yeah, if you're too lazy to read that, I have some bullet points. So you can read through these and I'll explain it. So the disinflation in the US can be attributed to several factors. So number one, it's the contractionary monetary policy. So as you might have read, the Federal Reserve implemented contractionary monetary policy, including raising base interest rates from 0.25 to 5.5% over the past 12 months. This policy actually aimed to reduce AD by increasing borrowing costs and reducing incentives for spending and investment, ultimately leading to a decrease in inflation, so effectively disinflation. So number two is the relationship between interest rates and inflation. So macroeconomic theory predicts that as interest rates rise, consumption and investment decrease due to higher borrowing costs and increased rewards for saving. This reduction in AD contributes to lower inflation rates. And number three is the global economic factors. The world's economy is recovery from supply chain constraints has led to decreased costs for manufactured goods such as cars and computers. Additionally, a significant decrease in energy costs, particularly oil and gases, have had a substantial impact on lowering inflation in the US and whatnot. Okay, now on to measuring inflation and deflation. So to measure it, you would use this index called the Consumer Price Index, which I have mentioned earlier, which is a measurement of cost of living or the cost of goods and services purchased by the typical household in an economy. So it is constructed by a statistical service in each country, which creates a hypothetical basket containing thousands of goods and services that are consumed by the typical household in the course of a year. So it could be separated into different groups, and they would calculate and estimate from there how much an average person would spend in their household. So the CPI is then constructed to show how the value of the basket changes from year to year by comparing its value with the base year. So basically they would compare it to a certain year with the year. Does that make sense? It would make sense in the following slide. Okay, so the summary, CPI is a measure of the cost of living for a typical household and compares the value of a basket of goods in 1 year with the value of the same basket in the same base year. Inflation and deflation are measured as a percentage change in the value of the basket from 1 year to another. A positive percentage change indicates inflation, a negative percentage change indicates deflation. So constructing a weighted price index. So a weighted price index is, again, a price index that weights the various goods and services according to their relative importance in consumer spending. So how to construct a price index. So decide on which years will be the base year. So we choose 2017. 2017 will be the base year. So then you will use the price of each good and service in the base year to calculate its base year value. So multiply quantity in column 2 here by 2017 prices in column 3 right here. This is the quantity you have, right? But then this is the base year you want, which is column 3. It's column 3 right here. And that would be this, right? That this times this is this. And then add up all the values in column 4, which is this 7756, and then use that again with the 2018. Use the same thing, and that would be 9798 and 900. I'm not sure if this makes sense. And if your base year, right? If your base year is 2017, the bottom would be 756, and then the value of basket in a specific year. So this one is in 2017, this one is in 2018, and this one is in 2019. So you could see the different rates of inflation right here. This is like cancels that because it's even. It's basically like that. I hope that makes sense. And you could look at it more here. Okay. I hope that makes sense. And problems with the Consumer Price Index, because there's always problems with indices. So, number 1, different rates of inflation for different income earners. The rate of inflation calculated by the use of the CPI reflects the change in average prices of goods and services included in the basket. However, different consumers have different consumption patterns depending on their income levels. May differ baskets. This means they face different rates of inflation than what is calculated on the basis of the CPI basket. Yep. And number 2, different rates of inflation depending on regional or cultural factors. Number 3, changes in consumption patterns due to consumer substitutions when relative price changes. Number 4, we have changes in consumption patterns due to increasing use of discount stores and sales. Changes in consumption patterns due to introduction of new products. Changes in product quality, international comparisons, and comparability over time. And I have causes of inflation. So there's 2 causes. We're going to focus on demand pull and cost push inflation. These 2 are the only ones you need to know for the IB. So with the demand pull inflation caused by increases in AD, in turn brought about by changes in any of the determinants of AD. So basically like this is something I drew and it's absolutely terrible, but I hope it makes sense. So increases in AD, this would have an inflationary gap, you see. This is, you're already, yeah. So essentially, right, let's think about it this way. Demand pull inflation is associated with an inflationary gap, which is basically this. Real GDP is greater than full employment GDP, and unemployment falls to a level below the natural rate of unemployment. So this is where you were, but this is where you are. And that's inflationary pressures because price levels have increased, as you can see. So it involves an excess of AD over AS, and you could draw it on the monetarist new classical model or the Keynesian model. Okay, and cost push inflation, caused by increases in cost of production or supply side shocks. So assume the economy is initially at the full employment. So it's right here. This is for deflation. So this is not the correct one. Yeah. Okay. Right. But I think you would get the gist of this. It's basically the same thing, but Saras and AD. It's kind of switched. Okay. Cost push and demand pull versus. So cost push again occurs when the costs of production increase, leading to producers to raise prices to maintain their profit margins. This can be triggered by factors such as rising wages, increased prices of raw materials, or disruptions in the supply chain. On the other hand, demand pull inflation results from an increase in AD for goods and services that surpasses the economy's ability to supply them. This can be fueled by factors like increased consumer spending, government expenditure, or investment. More information, because I love adding information. Okay, so the relationship between inflation, purchasing power, and nominal and real income. So when inflation is present, nominal income may rise, but if real income does not increase at the same rate or surpass inflation, individuals experience a decrease in their purchasing power. Inflation can lead to reduction in the real value of wages and savings, affecting consumers' ability to buy the same quantity of goods and services. So if something was $10, right? If you had $10, but then there's inflation, right? The value of the $10 goes down. But if there was deflation, and you have $10, the $10 goes up in value. So it's basically like that. Costs of inflation, redistribution effects, uncertainty, effects on saving, international export, competitiveness, effects on economic growth, effects on resource allocation. Thank you. And that's about it. Thanks.